Everyone. I'm Noah, and I'll be going over malaria for my disease report presentation. I'll try not to bore you, and let's get started. So here's a brief history of malaria. About 3200 to 1200 BC, we detected malaria antigens in some Egyptian remains, so that's about 5,000 years ago. So you can kind of get an idea of when malaria began, or at least as we know, began to infect humans. 2700 BC, we start to see Chinese documents referencing malaria-like symptoms. Around 2000 BC, Mesopotamian tablets reference something similar to malaria. 1500 to 800 BC, that's a typo. Hindu texts in India reference what could be malaria. You're probably familiar with this one. Homer in the Iliad mentions something that's like the Iliad. Maybe you picked up on that or not. Later, Hippocrates, around 400 BC, links Sirius constellation with the malarial fever. Maybe he began to identify it with the constellation, but we all know that stars probably don't cause disease. Around 100 AD, malaria begins to appear in Rome. So it's making its way from Africa around the Fertile Crescent to Greece and then to Rome. That's how it's thought to be brought up there. About the 15th to 19th century, during the Atlantic slave trade, you see the malarial disease brought to the New World. In around 1750, Latin America, malaria exists now from Latin America to New England, so it's made its presence in the New World. In the year 1800, however, we start to get an edge on the disease. We find out what caused it. It's a parasite under the genus Plasmodium, and we'll get to that in just a minute. In 1897, Ronald Ross identifies mosquitoes as the vector. He finds that as a vector in birds, in avian malaria. It's not identified in the vector isn't identified in humans until a couple years later. In 1942, the United States forms the Malaria Control and War Area uh, organization, which is designed to, you wouldn't believe it, control malaria in war areas. So during World War II, we fought in the Pacific and we encountered malaria in the islands in the Pacific, and that's why this was formed. So in 1946, after the war ends, the MCWA becomes the Communicable Disease Center, the CDC, which later becomes, the Centers for Disease Protection. So it's actually this is where the CDC comes from to combat malaria. From 1947 to 1951, the U.S. runs a very strong campaign against malaria and eliminates it in the United States. And that brings us to the present day, where malaria is pretty much no longer an issue in most of the world. Now, what is malaria? Here's a picture here. The parasite that causes malaria, I believe this is Plasmodium falciparum. So probably could have guessed malaria is a disease, and it's caused by a multitude of parasites, not bacteria, but actually parasites. And they are all from the genus Plasmodium. There are four species of Plasmodium that infects humans. Technically five. We'll get to that in just a second. There's Plasmodium falciparum, as we just saw, P. vivax, P. ovale, P. malariae, and P. knowlesi. Um, it's kind of debated because it infects humans zoonotically. So initially, it infects macaques, that's a primate, and the primates can then infect humans. So four species that infect humans, technically five, depends on if you want to count it or not. The only vector for malaria is this genus of mosquito, Anopheles. Um, Only the female mosquitoes transmit the parasite because only the female mosquitoes need blood, and that's just to reproduce. Male mosquitoes need something like nectar, kind of like bees or butterflies. So male mosquitoes are harmless. Female mosquitoes are the annoying ones, if you will. Statistics and a joke. See who get a WHO? Okay. Uh, there are an estimated about 2,000 cases annually in the United States, which are approximately five deaths. So not a problem. Very minute. And here in the U.S. and similar in other developed countries, most of these cases are thought to have come from people who've either traveled overseas to places where malaria is endemic, or from immigrants from Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, who brought the disease with them. In 2019, the WHO estimated there are about 229 million cases. So, for reference, that's about two-thirds the population of the United States. So, not a small number, with about 409,000 deaths. And that was just in 2019. 90% of these deaths come from sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll get into that a little later. Malaria is very prevalent in Africa and constitutes, as you can see, the majority of these cases. Most of these deaths come from children from under 5 years of age. Here's a map showing where the Plasmodium species are found. So you can see in Central America, the Caribbean, South America, um, Asia here, even in Oceania and Papua New Guinea. But you can see most of these cases, most of these species are found in sub-Saharan Africa. Here's the Saharan desert. You can see it's summit. It's crazy. You wouldn't believe it. How do you get it? Malaria is not contagious. The only way it can be transmitted is through contracting the parasite through the blood. So you can touch someone with malaria. You probably shouldn't. I don't know why you would. But you can't get it through physical contact, airborne droplets, touching, sexual contact, etc. So like I said, malaria can only be transmitted through a vector, i.e. the Anopheles mosquito. Blood transfusions, because of the infected blood, malaria, the parasite infects the blood. We'll get to that in just a minute. Organ transplants, shared needles, or congenitally, meaning at birth. Who's at risk? Anyone who goes to a place that malaria is endemic to. And also these aforementioned causes, but that's incredibly rare. The interesting part, the life cycle of malaria, and I'll see if I can take you through this without numbing your brain. So we'll start here at number one. The mosquito takes a blood meal and injects its sporocytes, sporozoites. Basically, that's the spore form, the spore stage of the malarial parasite, the Plasmodium parasite. And so when the mosquito feeds on your blood, it injects saliva in to basically stop the blood from coagulating so it can get the meal easier, the blood easier. And then that saliva is the parasite. So that's when the saliva is injected into your blood, that's when it's first introduced. Eventually the spore will mature. Well, first the spore infects the liver cell, and it's thought to infect the liver cell just because that's where it can be to avoid an immune response, avoid immune system surveillance. Eventually, so after it infects the liver cell, it'll form the schizons, like a cell where it matures, and that'll eventually rupture, forming these merozoites. These merozoites, kind of like amoeba-like, they'll then infect the red blood cell. That's where it'll start to mature, and you'll see two different paths it can take. This is like the asexual path where it will mature, reproduce asexually, rupture, and the cycle will just begin again. Or it can take the second path and form the sexually reproducing one, the trophozoite path. That'll mature into gametocytes, male, female. Male is a microgametocyte, female is macrogametocyte. That'll start to mature in the red blood cell. So then we get to the point where the mosquito then drinks up the blood, ingests it, and then the parasite will then reproduce in the mosquito, forming a zygote that becomes motile, that becomes the ookinete. Uh, and then it'll eventually form the oocyst. Well, after the ookinete invades the midgut wall of the mosquito, it'll form the oocyst. And it's like a cyst, it's like a hard, uh, walled cell sort of thing. That'll stay in the mosquito until eventually it bursts, releasing the sporozoites, which then get into the saliva of the mosquito, and bada boom, bada bing, we're back to stage one. How does malaria cause harm? That's probably the question most people are asking as they stare mindlessly at this presentation. After infecting the red blood cells, the parasite reaches an asexual stage, cover that. Any waste it produces will be released into the red blood cell, damaging and potentially killing it. So basically, when the parasite infects the red blood cell, um, it's the host cell, like any other virus. It damages the cell in order to survive and reproduce. So eventually, these red blood cells will lyse, and that's probably a bad thing, as you might have guessed. Not having blood is not very healthy. And the incubation period here is 7 to 30 days. I kind of just slipped that one in. So here's some actual, scientific terms that you can use to quantify the damage done. Anemia, the lack of red blood cells, leads to a lack of oxygen delivered in the body because red blood cells carry the oxygen around your body. Not having red blood cells means no oxygen. That'll lead to dizziness, shortness of breath, tiredness. It also causes jaundice, which is when it's kind of like hepatitis. Kind of makes your skin, the whites of your eyes, your mucous membranes turn yellow. That's because the liver, who has to like filter all these red blood cells that are breaking down, it just gets overwhelmed, and a substance in the red blood cells, the bilirubin, begins to build up, and that's what causes the yellow pigment. Um, so for the maturation periods of these different species, they have kind of different Maturation periods, depending on which species you have. So for P. vivax and P. aurelie, they mature every 48 hours. So it's considered tertian malaria, kind of like every third day, if that makes sense. P. malariae matures every 72 hours. Cordon malaria, so it's like every 4 days. I think that makes sense. Um, P. falciparum, which is the most severe of all the species, is generally irregular, but usually follows the 48-hour maturation period. Signs and symptoms. So there's two different types of malaria. There's uncomplicated and severe. Uncomplicated, a lot less fatal than severe, and generally most people recover. But it's not very fun to go through, I'd imagine. It has three stages, lasts about each attack of malaria has three stages, lasts about 6 to 10 hours. And these begin when the schizont bursts. Let's go back. When the schizont bursts here and releases the merozoites, that's when symptoms start to occur. So the first stage, the cold stage, you'll get feelings of cold, you'll start to shiver, and that lasts about 15 to 60 minutes. Then there's the hot stage, what most people are familiar with, the fevers, the headaches, the vomitings, potential seizures in young children that last about 2 to 6 hours. And then the final stage, the sweating stage, which is where you sweat, return to normal temperature, that's about 2 to 4 hours. So if we'll go back, we'll see that depending on which species you've contracted, or which species you have, these attacks will occur every 48 hours, 72 hours, or with P. falciparum, it's somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's both. So for severe malaria, these occur from complications with severe organ failure, abnormalities in the blood. Like I said, not having blood is not very good for you. So this will lead to further complications. Cerebral malaria, impairment of consciousness, seizures, coma, neurological abnormalities, inflammation of lungs, low blood pressure, acute kidney injury, hyperparasitemia. That's when more than 5% of your blood cells have been infected with the parasite, hypoglycemia, metabolic acidosis, all symptom signs of severe malaria. Typically not a good thing to happen. Malaria diagnosis. So in places where malaria is uncommon, such as developed countries, it's usually not considered among diagnoses. So if you get malaria and you come back to say the US and you're feeling ill, you're vomiting, you got shivers, it may not even be considered. When you go to the doctor, they may call it the flu, they may call it the cold, just because it's so uncommon. Like 2,000 out of the population in the U.S., which I believe is about 330 million, is less than 1% of 1%. It's so minute. It'd be surprising for you to have it. Um, Now, if you have the more severe symptoms, that usually makes doctors a little more suspicious of it, and they'll probably diagnose it a little more accurately. But each diagnosis, should be followed up by a lab test for confirmation because if you have it, you kind of want to know if you have it so they can treat it accordingly. These can be detected through staining the parasite, antigen detection, molecular diagnosis, and serology. There are four main factors that contribute to deciding on treatment: the species of the parasite, the clinical status of the patient, expected drug susceptibility, and previous use of antimalarials. Very straightforward. For the species, there's different ways you can treat each species. P. falciparum and P. knowlesi spread quickly and cause rapid illness and death, so it's very important to diagnose that as soon as possible. But since it does cause rapid illness, it should be easier to identify, especially if you've been in a place where malaria is endemic. P. vivax and P. ovale, they're a little different. They actually have hypnozoites, and those are like the dormant version of a spore. So they can lay in your liver cells for months or even years. Um, so those should be treated if it's determined that you have either vivax or ovale, because if you don't treat the hypnozoites, then the malaria disease will just come back and start all over again. That's no fun. P. falciparum and P. vivax have drug resistance, certain drug resistance, depending on where they're from, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Clinical status. So patients with uncomplicated malaria can be given oral antimalarials. It's generally a very straightforward thing to treat as long as it's not too severe. But if it is severe, then usually they'll have to be treated with intravenous antimalarial therapy. Drug susceptibility, like I said, um, some places where the parasite is endemic have some drug resistance, so you can use some drugs, not the others. And obviously, you don't want to give them drug resistance because, well, it should be self-evident. And you shouldn't use antimalarials that you've used before to prevent it. A little side note, gametocytes are not targeted by these antimalarials. Prevention. What's the easiest way to not get malaria? Don't go to a place where malaria is endemic. My goodness, what an idea. Why didn't I think of that? practical ways to avoid malaria. Use a mixture of mosquito techniques, tools, and chemoprophylaxis. The techniques and tools: wear long sleeve clothing so the mosquitoes can't bite you. Apply mosquito spray often. It's more effective if it contains the chemical DEET. In places where malaria is prevalent, typically a mosquito net will be provided around the bed. Since this mosquito is nocturnal, it feeds at night. And typically, you'll be sleeping at night, so just keeping a net around your bed while you sleep is sometimes or typically enough to protect you. Um, I made this drug chart for medicine for the chemoprophylaxis medicines used to prevent disease or infection. There's Malarone, chloroquine, doxycycline, mefloquine, primaquine, difenaquine. You can kind of stick hydroxychloroquine under here. I just didn't have room for it. But each of these will tell you how long to take it before traveling, when to take it after or during traveling, and side effects and some other notes. Um, but that concludes the presentation. I hope it didn't bore you to death. Some references here, and thank you for your forced participation.